You ever stop and wonder how our entire world got buried under this just mountain of debt? I mean, think about it. If every country on Earth owes money, who exactly did they borrow it from? Okay, let's really dive into this because the answer reveals four kind of hidden innovations that built the very financial system we live in today. First off, let's just get a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about. The total debt in the world is somewhere around $300 trillion. Now, to put that number in perspective, the entire world's economic output, everything we produce in a single year, is about $100 trillion. So yeah, we collectively owe 3 times more than we make, which of course leads to the big question, right? If the US is in debt, and China is in debt, and India is in debt, who's holding all the IOUs? To understand this paradox, we've got to go back in time and meet 4 people who, piece by piece, basically constructed the machine of modern debt. So, our story kicks off way back in the 17th century with a really simple but massive problem for anyone who was trying to lend money. Back then, kings needed cash for everything. Building armies, fighting wars, all that stuff. They'd borrow from wealthy merchants. But here was the catch. The king was all-powerful. If he just decided not to repay the loan, well, what were you going to do? Argue with him? He'd throw you in jail, or worse. Lending to a ruler was a huge, huge gamble.
Then, in 1694, this Scottish trader named William Paterson comes along with a totally revolutionary idea. King William III of England desperately needed money for a war with France, but nobody would lend to him. So Paterson says, look, I'll get you the money, but on one condition. We won't be lending it to you, the king. We'll be lending it to the nation of England, to Parliament.
And that one little shift changed everything. Suddenly, the debt wasn't tied to a mortal king anymore. It was tied to the immortal state itself. It would be paid back not from the king's pockets, but from taxes collected from the people, pretty much forever. And just like that, for the first time, national debt became permanent. So, okay, debt was now permanent, but it was still mostly contained inside individual nations. Well, that all changed during the Napoleonic Wars, and it's all thanks to our second architect. So, to raise money, governments would issue what are called bonds. Just think of it like a formal IOU. You give the government, say, £10,000, and they give you a piece of paper promising to pay you back with interest over time. The problem was, at £10,000 a pop, only the absolute wealthiest people could afford to play this game. Now here's where Nathan Rothschild's simple genius comes in. He took those massive, super expensive government bonds and he just broke them down into small, affordable chunks. All of a sudden, a normal doctor or an engineer or even a shopkeeper could lend money to the government. And Rothschild's huge family network didn't just sell them in England, no, they sold them all across Europe. And this created a global web. The Bank of England was holding French bonds, French banks were holding Austrian bonds, and so on and so on. Now, if one country even threatens to default, it wasn't just their problem anymore. It would set off a crazy chain reaction threatening to bring down banks everywhere. The system now had this powerful, built-in incentive for everyone to make sure nobody failed. All right, so the system was permanent and it was global, but it still had one major limitation: actual physical gold. And our third architect, well, he would find a way to remove that barrier completely. For centuries, money was tied to what was called the gold standard. It meant a government could only print as much paper money as it had actual gold sitting in a vault somewhere to back it up. This put a hard physical limit on how much money, and therefore how much debt, could be created. But as it turns out, this system was way too rigid for a fast-growing economy. This became super clear during the Panic of 1907 in America. A failed business deal triggered this wave of fear, and people just rushed to pull their money out of the banks. The entire financial system was on the verge of collapsing until one guy, the incredibly powerful banker J.P. Morgan, personally stepped in, using his own money and forcing other bankers to do the same to save it. Morgan realized, this is no way to run a country. He secretly gathered the nation's top bankers, and together they designed a new system, a central bank called the Federal Reserve. Now here's the magic trick. When the government needs money now, it gives a bond to the Fed. The Fed doesn't start printing cash. It just opens up a computer and digitally adds numbers to the government's account. I know it's a bit more complex than that, but in essence, it's creating credit right out of thin air. And just like that, poof, the physical limit was gone. The amount of debt a government could take on was no longer tied to a pile of shiny metal in a basement. It was now, for all intents and purposes, digitally unlimited. So now we have a system of debt that's permanent, global, and unlimited. But that just creates a new, maybe even scarier question. What happens if this supercharged system actually breaks? Well, this brings us to our final architect. Back in the late 1970s, the US was fighting some crazy inflation. So, in 1979, the head of the Fed, a guy named Paul Volcker, decided to solve the problem by massively hiking interest rates. We're talking from 8% to a staggering 20% in just over a year. It worked for the US, but it unleashed a global crisis. I mean, think about it. Countries like Mexico and Brazil had taken out huge loans from American banks when the interest rate was at 8%. And then, boom, overnight their payments more than doubled. They just couldn't afford it. Mexico actually announced it was about to default, which would have collapsed the major U.S. banks who'd lent it all that money. So what was the solution? Well, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, stepped in with the fourth and final innovation. The IMF gave Mexico a brand new emergency loan. But here's the catch. Mexico had to use that new money to immediately pay back its old loans to the American banks. It's kind of like a parent giving their kid money just so they can pay off a loan shark. It prevents a disaster, but it doesn't really solve the root problem. And with that move, the system basically became unfailable. A global safety net was created to stop these catastrophic defaults. But the price was that countries got locked into this perpetual cycle, constantly borrowing new money just to pay off the interest on their old debts. So let's pull this all together now. These four innovations, stacked on top of each other over 300 years, they really did create the world that we live in right now.
First, debt was made a permanent feature of the state, not some temporary loan to a king. Then it was globalized, connecting everyone in this web of mutual interest. After that, it was made digitally unlimited, totally freed from the limits of physical gold. And finally, it was made unfailable, with a lender of last resort to prevent a total collapse.
And all of this leads us to a pretty shocking conclusion. All this debt we see in the world, all $300 trillion of it, it isn't a bug in the system. It is the system. The bridges we drive on, the jets in the sky, the hospitals, the salaries. Almost everything in our modern world is built on this foundation of debt. It's not a flaw. It really is the oxygen our economy breathes. Which leaves us with a final, kind of fascinating question. We're all told that debt is bad, right? That we should get rid of it. But if it's the very foundation of our entire world, what would actually happen if tomorrow we all just paid it back? What would that world even look like? Definitely something to think about.